Why was the only person keeping the commander alive the same woman he had already decided to fire? The mud brick wall was crumbling in places, but to Tessa Harlow it looked like the most beautiful structure on earth. Walls meant cover, walls meant seconds, and seconds meant survival. She pressed her back against it, breath steady despite the pain burning through her left shoulder. A fragment of metal had sliced through the narrow gap between her armor and sleeve earlier. 4 inches of open flesh. She had cleaned it and wrapped it herself during a lull in the fighting. 40 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Now her left hand held the decompression needle carefully placed in Sergeant Garrison's chest. His breathing had been shallow minutes ago, lungs collapsing from the pressure building inside. The needle kept the air escaping. Her right hand gripped the radio. "Kowalski," she said calmly into the static. "Eastern wall is clear. G is stable for now, but he needs extraction in 20 minutes. Do not push north until the second position is confirmed." The radio crackled. "Copy," Kowalski replied, "working on it." Tessa glanced down at Garrison. His color had improved slightly, still pale, still fragile, but alive. Alive was enough. The firefight around the compound had gone strangely quiet. That kind of silence made soldiers uneasy. It usually meant someone was repositioning, or someone was bleeding out. The paper inside her left chest pocket rustled when she shifted her weight. She didn't need to read it again. She knew every word. Dismissal order. Signed 48 hours earlier. The signature belonged to the same man, lying on the ground beside her now. Commander Daniel Briggs. 2 days ago he had looked at her record, her quiet demeanor, and the fact that she rarely spoke unless spoken to. Then he decided she had no field presence, no leadership, no practical combat value. Tessa had accepted the paper without arguing. She folded it once and slipped it into her pocket. Sometimes dignity didn't need a response. But now the battlefield had rewritten the conversation. Garrison coughed weakly. "Stay with me," she murmured. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She checked the seal of the dressing again. Her shoulder throbbed, but she ignored it. Pain could wait. Oxygen could not. Boots thundered across gravel behind her. Commander Briggs dropped to one knee beside them. His uniform was dust-covered, rifle still hot from the last burst of fire. "What's his status?" he demanded. Tessa didn't look up. "Tension pneumothorax, needle decompression done. He'll live if we move him soon." Briggs blinked, surprised at the precision. Then he noticed the blood on her sleeve. "You're hit." "Fragments," she replied calmly, "not critical." She didn't mention the fact she had stitched the wound herself with a field kit 5 minutes earlier. Briggs studied her face for a moment. Something about her composure unsettled him. Around them, soldiers were repositioning. Radios crackled. The wind carried the smell of dust and burnt powder. Then the first shot cracked from the northern ridge. The ambush wasn't over. And suddenly, the medic with no skills became the most important soldier in the compound. But there was something no one here knew yet. Not about her. Not about the war she had already survived long before arriving at this base. And not about the commander whose life she would soon save, again. Why did the quiet medic never argue when people underestimated her? 2 months earlier, Tessa Harlow stepped off a CH-47 helicopter into the heat of Fob Salerno. Dust swirled around the landing zone like a desert storm. She carried 2 bags, a medical pack, and everything else she owned. The duty sergeant looked at her paperwork and raised an eyebrow. "Combat medic." "Yes." He glanced at her again, measuring. She was smaller than most soldiers on base, calm, almost reserved. "You'll be attached to Briggs' unit," he said. That name didn't mean anything to her then. But it would soon. The base itself was busy, loud, impatient. Soldiers moved quickly between missions. Everyone had somewhere to be. Except the new medic. People watched her quietly. New arrivals were always judged quickly in places like this. At the morning briefing the next day, Commander Briggs scanned the room. His team was built for aggressive patrols, fast decisions, hard movements. Then he noticed her sitting quietly at the end of the table. "You're the new medic?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Field experience?" "Some." That answer annoyed him immediately. "Some." That wasn't a number. That wasn't a record. Later he reviewed her file. It was thin. Very thin. Too thin. Most lines had been redacted. Training units, special programs, deployment locations blacked out. To Briggs it looked suspicious. To Tessa it looked normal. Because silence had been part of her job for years. During patrols she moved quietly among the soldiers, checking gear, replacing medical tape, adjusting straps. She spoke rarely. But she watched everything. The way Kowalski limped slightly on his right knee. The way Garrison held his rifle tighter when they crossed open ground. The way Briggs constantly scanned rooftops before doorways. Observation was survival. Still, the team wasn't convinced. Some thought she looked too calm. Others thought she looked afraid. Both assumptions were wrong. 3 weeks later, the decision came down. Briggs called her into the command tent. He placed a single paper on the table. "You're competent in the clinic," he said, "but this team operates differently." She waited. "You hesitate too much." That was the word he used. Hesitate. Tessa studied the paper. Dismissal from forward patrol assignment. Transfer pending. Her expression never changed. "If that's the order," she said quietly. Briggs expected protest. He expected explanation. Instead, she folded the paper and placed it in her pocket. No anger. No defense. Just acceptance. That reaction confused him more than anything. What Briggs didn't know was simple. Tessa had worked in places where hesitation meant death. But patience saved lives. And patience looked a lot like hesitation to people who didn't understand it. 2 days later, the convoy rolled toward a village compound north of the valley. Intel said it was quiet. Intel was wrong. And within minutes of entering the compound, everything went violently dark. Because the enemy had been waiting. And the medic everyone underestimated was about to become the only reason the mission survived. How does someone stay calm when chaos erupts all around them? The first explosion hit the eastern wall. Dust and debris blasted across the courtyard. Soldiers dropped instantly into defensive positions. "Contact," someone shouted. Automatic fire tore across the compound entrance. Briggs dove behind a stone trough and returned fire. The ambush had been planned perfectly. High ground. Crossfire. No easy escape. Within seconds, 2 soldiers were down. Garrison was the worst. He collapsed beside the water well, gasping. Tessa moved before anyone else did. Her medical bag slammed into the dirt beside him as she rolled him onto his back. Collapsed lung. She recognized the signs instantly. Breathing shallow. Neck veins swelling. Panic in his eyes. "Tessa," he wheezed. "You're okay," she said. Her hands moved fast but steady. Needle. Angle. Pressure release. The hiss of trapped air escaping sounded almost like relief itself. Garrison's chest lifted again. Life returning. Meanwhile, the firefight intensified. Rounds snapped against the mud wall inches above them. Still, Tessa didn't rush. Because rushing made mistakes. And mistakes killed people. She checked his pulse again. Better. Around them, Briggs was coordinating defense. North Ridge, 2 shooters. Kowalski fired back. Dust clouds erupted from the hillside. But something about the firing pattern bothered Tessa. Too organized. Too patient. She grabbed the radio. Kowalski, she said. What? They're holding the second position. How do you know? She paused. Because explaining instinct in a firefight was difficult. Because they stopped firing, she replied. A moment later, a second burst came from the ridge behind them. Exactly where she predicted. Kowalski cursed. How the hell? But there was no time to ask. Briggs turned toward her briefly. That look said something had shifted. He wasn't seeing the quiet medic anymore. He was seeing someone who understood battle rhythm. Someone trained. Someone experienced. And suddenly, a question started forming in his mind. Who exactly was Tessa Harlow? But the answer would come much later. Because the mission wasn't over. Not even close. And within minutes, Briggs himself would become the next man bleeding on the ground. Saved by the medic he had already tried to send home. What happens when the person you doubted becomes the reason you're still alive? The bullet struck Briggs during the second push toward the northern wall. He didn't even feel it at first. Just the sudden loss of strength in his leg. Then the ground rushed upward. Pain followed a heartbeat later. Tessa, someone yelled. She was already moving. Blood pooled beneath Briggs' thigh. Arterial. Bad. Very bad. Pressure, she ordered. Kowalski pressed hard against the wound, while Tessa pulled a tourniquet from her kit. Her hands moved with practiced precision. Twist. Luck. Secure. Briggs gritted his teeth. You're lucky, she said quietly. He almost laughed. Lucky. You missed the artery by 2 millimeters. Her voice carried no drama. Just fact. For the first time, Briggs studied her closely. Not as a medic. As a soldier. You've done this before, he said. Tessa didn't answer. Instead, she checked the dressing again. Because the truth was complicated. And because survival came before explanations. By the time the extraction helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, 3 soldiers were alive who shouldn't have been. Garrison, Briggs, and Kowalski. All because of one medic who supposedly had no field skills. As the helicopter lifted off, Briggs noticed the paper slipping slightly from her chest pocket. Dismissal order. Signed by him. He looked away. Ashamed. But Tessa didn't mention it. Because dignity rarely asks for apologies. It simply keeps doing the work. And sometimes, the work speaks louder than words ever could. How do you face the man who nearly died under your hands, after he was the one who tried to send you away? The helicopter blades carved through the evening air like distant thunder. Inside the medevac, the world was loud, vibrating, urgent. The metallic smell of blood mixed with aviation fuel as the aircraft climbed above the valley. Tessa Harlow sat on the narrow bench, one hand braced against the wall to steady herself as turbulence shook the cabin. Her other hand held firm pressure on Commander Briggs' bandaged leg. The tourniquet was tight, the bleeding had slowed, but the wound was still dangerous. Across from her, Garrison lay strapped to a stretcher, oxygen mask fogging with each breath. His color had returned slightly, though every inhale still looked like work. Kowalski sat beside him, silent. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the roar of the helicopter filled the space. Briggs finally broke the silence. You stitched your own shoulder. It wasn't a question. Tessa glanced down briefly at the dark patch soaking through her sleeve. "Temporary closure," she said calmly. 3 stitches. "You did it during the firefight." "Yes." Briggs stared at her. Not disbelief, not quite admiration either. Something more complicated. "You didn't report it." "It wasn't the priority." Another pause. The medic in front of him looked composed, steady, almost detached from the chaos they had just survived. And that unsettled him more than anything. Most soldiers shook after something like that. Adrenaline crash. Shock. But Tessa's breathing remained slow. Her hands never trembled. Finally, Briggs said the thing he had been thinking since the compound. "You predicted the second sniper." Tessa adjusted the bandage slightly. "They were disciplined," she replied. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." Briggs leaned his head back against the metal wall, studying the ceiling. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet realization was forming. He had made a mistake. A big one. But pride was a stubborn thing. "You ever serve in another combat unit?" he asked. Her eyes lifted briefly, then dropped again. "Medical units." That was all she offered. Kowalski finally spoke up from across the cabin. "Medical units don't read ambush patterns like that." The helicopter jolted through another pocket of rough air. Tessa said nothing. Not because she was hiding something. Because explaining the past often created more problems than it solved. And her past was complicated. The medic across from them wasn't just trained. She had once been part of missions most soldiers never even heard about. But those days were buried now. Or at least they were supposed to be. The helicopter began its descent toward the forward surgical hospital. Green lights appeared below them in the darkness. The pilot's voice crackled over the headset. 2 minutes. Tessa tightened the bandage one last time. "Stay awake," she told Briggs. He gave a tired half-smile. "That an order, medic?" "Yes, sir." For the first time since the mission began, there was almost humor in her voice. But beneath that calm surface, something else stirred quietly. Because once they landed, the questions would start. And the truth she had spent years avoiding might finally surface. The truth about the quiet medic who never raised her voice. The medic who could read a battlefield like a map. The medic whose file looked strangely incomplete. But for now, survival came first. And survival was still fragile. Why did the commander feel more unsettled in the hospital than he had during the ambush? The surgical ward smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as stretchers rolled through the doors. Nurses moved quickly between beds, their voices calm but urgent. War had its own rhythm inside a hospital. Controlled chaos. Tessa walked beside Briggs' stretcher as the doctors wheeled him towards surgery. A nurse glanced at her shoulder. "You're bleeding." "Not significantly," Tessa replied. "That's not the point." Another medic guided her toward an empty bed. "Sit." Tessa hesitated. Garrison was being moved to another operating room. Briggs disappeared behind swinging doors. The moment the doors shut, the tension she had been carrying quietly for hours shifted inside her chest. Not panic. Not fear. Just the heavy silence that came after survival. She finally sat. A nurse carefully cut away her sleeve. The wound underneath made the nurse wince. "That's deeper than 3 stitches." "6 would hold better," Tessa said calmly. The nurse looked up. "You sound like you've done this before." "I have." While the nurse cleaned the wound, Kowalski stepped into the ward. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Watching her. Not suspiciously. Curiously. "You're not what I expected," he said. Tessa didn't look up. "What did you expect?" "Someone quieter." She almost smiled. "I am quiet." "No," Kowalski said slowly. "You're controlled." That word lingered in the air. Controlled. Like someone trained not just in medicine, but in survival. The nurse finished stitching. "Try not to move that arm for a few days." "I'll manage." Kowalski shook his head. "You saved 3 lives today." Tessa simply nodded, because praise never sat comfortably with her. Across the ward, the operating room doors finally opened. A surgeon stepped out, removing his gloves. Kowalski stood immediately. "How is he?" The surgeon exhaled. "He'll live." Relief spread quietly through the room. But the surgeon's eyes drifted toward Tessa. "You stabilized him in the field." "Yes." He studied her for a long moment. "That was advanced trauma work." Another pause. Then he added something unexpected. "You trained somewhere special." Tessa held his gaze calmly. "Just experience." The surgeon didn't look convinced. And neither did Kowalski. But neither pushed further. For now, because the battlefield had already raised enough questions. Questions about the medic who never panicked, never hesitated, never asked for recognition, yet somehow always seemed to be exactly where she was needed most. But the biggest question still remained unanswered. Why would someone with that level of experience allow herself to be dismissed so easily? Why fold the paper and say nothing? The answer was buried years in the past. In another war, another mission, and another commander whose life she had once saved. A commander who didn't survive the next day. That memory still followed her. Quietly, like a shadow she could never quite outrun. What kind of soldier hides their strength instead of proving it? 3 days later, Commander Briggs returned to base on crutches. The valley looked different now. Not quieter, just heavier. Word about the ambush had spread quickly. And so had something else. The story of the medic who kept half the team alive. Tessa was restocking medical supplies when Briggs entered the clinic. For a moment he simply stood there, watching her. She worked with the same calm focus she always had. Inventory lists, bandage packs, antibiotics. The same medic he thought he understood weeks ago. Except now he knew he didn't understand her at all. "You should be resting," he said finally. She looked up. "You should be too, sir." Briggs held up the crutches. "This is resting." Silence settled between them. Then he reached into his pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Tessa recognized it instantly. The dismissal order. "I made a mistake," Briggs said quietly. She studied the paper, then slid it back toward him. "You made a decision. That decision nearly removed the best medic in my unit." She met his eyes. "No," she replied softly. "It removed someone you didn't understand yet." The words weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They were simply honest. Briggs sat down across from her. "Your record is redacted." "Yes." "You read battlefield movement like an operator." "Observation helps." "You stitched yourself during an ambush." "Necessary." Briggs exhaled slowly. "You're avoiding the question." Tessa closed the medical case in front of her. Then she finally said something she had avoided for months. "I used to work with a reconnaissance unit." Briggs leaned forward. "What kind of reconnaissance unit?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't trust him. Because once certain truths were spoken, they changed everything. and the quiet medic everyone had underestimated would no longer be invisible. But sometimes the past refused to stay buried, especially in war, and especially when the person standing in front of you had already saved your life. Twice, Tessa finally spoke again, and the first piece of the truth slipped into the light. I wasn't always just a medic. Her voice remained calm, but something deeper moved behind her eyes. Before this assignment, I was part of a special reconnaissance team. Briggs didn't speak. He simply listened, because the quietest soldier in his unit was finally beginning to reveal the story she had kept hidden. A story that would explain everything. Her patience, her silence, her refusal to prove herself, and the quiet strength that had already saved more lives than anyone realized. But even that truth was only the beginning, because the war had one more test waiting, one more mission, and the next time bullets started flying, the medic with no skills would once again be the reason someone survived. Why would a soldier hide years of elite combat experience just to serve quietly as a medic? Commander Briggs didn't speak for a long moment. The clinic felt unusually still. Outside, the base carried on with its usual rhythm: boots on gravel, distant engines, a helicopter warming somewhere on the flight line. But inside the small room, everything had slowed. Tessa Harlow had just opened a door she had kept closed for years. Briggs leaned back slightly in the chair. "A reconnaissance team," he repeated. Tessa nodded once. "Medical specialist attached to the unit. That doesn't explain how you predicted an ambush pattern." Her eyes drifted briefly to the window. Dust moved across the base in slow waves, the same way it had on dozens of deployments before this one. "That unit didn't just observe," she said quietly. "We moved ahead of larger forces, sometimes days ahead." Briggs understood immediately. Forward recon. The kind that operated without backup. The kind that required soldiers to read terrain, patterns, and human behavior before a single shot was fired. "Why leave?" he asked. Tessa didn't answer right away. Her fingers rested lightly on the metal table. Still, controlled. But something inside her posture shifted, the faint tightening of someone stepping near a painful memory. "Because someone didn't make it home," she said. Briggs felt the weight in those words instantly. "You blame yourself." It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it. The quiet medic who never reacted under pressure suddenly looked human. Not weak, just carrying something heavy. "There was a mission in the mountains," she said slowly. 3 years ago. The memory unfolded in her mind with painful clarity. Cold air, thin oxygen, a 4-person recon team watching a convoy route from the cliffs above. They had been there to track movement, not engage. Just observe, report, disappear. But war rarely followed clean instructions. "The convoy stopped," Tessa continued, "earlier than expected." Briggs listened carefully. "An IED team arrived," she said. "They were planting explosives for a civilian road convoy scheduled the next morning. That changed everything. Waiting would mean civilians dying. Engaging meant revealing their hidden position." The team leader had hesitated. Just for a moment. Tessa remembered that moment vividly. The tension, the silent calculation. Then the team leader turned to her. "What do you see, medic?" She had scanned the terrain, calculated distances, angles, escape routes. "We can stop them," she said. That decision changed everything. The recon team attacked. Quick, precise, violent. The IED crew, never finished planting the device. But the firefight triggered something worse. Hidden insurgents in the canyon walls. The recon team suddenly found themselves outnumbered. The extraction helicopter was 40 minutes away. That was an eternity in a mountain ambush. We held the ridge, Tessa said quietly. Until we couldn't. Her voice remained steady. But Briggs could hear the quiet grief inside it. The team leader was hit, she said. Chest wound, massive bleeding. She had done everything. Pressure, sealing the wound, emergency airway. She even tried to carry him down the ridge during the extraction. But blood loss doesn't negotiate. He died before the helicopter landed, she finished. Silence filled the clinic. Briggs finally understood something important. The reason she never rushed. The reason she stayed calm during chaos. The reason she never tried to prove herself. She had already learned the hardest truth in combat. Sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough. And after that, Briggs asked softly. I transferred to medical operations, Tessa replied. No more recon missions. Briggs studied her carefully. You didn't fail that mission. Her eyes met his. That's not how it feels. The honesty in that statement hung in the air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the base alarm suddenly cut through the silence. A sharp electronic tone echoed across the compound. Incoming patrol. Medical emergency. Tessa stood immediately. The conversation ended the same way her past always did. Quietly, she grabbed her trauma kit without hesitation. Briggs watched her move. Efficient. Focused. The same medic who had stabilized him on the battlefield. Except now, he understood something deeper. She wasn't just saving lives. She was trying to balance the life she couldn't save. Outside, a truck skidded to a stop near the clinic entrance. 2 soldiers rushed inside, carrying a wounded private. Blood soaked through the man's uniform. Gunshot wound to the abdomen. Tessa moved fast, but never rushed. Lay him here, she instructed calmly. The clinic transformed instantly into controlled chaos. Gloves, scissors, bandages, monitoring pulse. Briggs watched the entire scene unfold from his chair. And something inside him shifted again. This wasn't just skill. This was experience carved by loss. Minutes passed. The bleeding slowed. The soldier stabilized. Another life pulled back from the edge. When the med team finally wheeled the private towards surgery, the room grew quiet again. Tessa removed her gloves slowly. Briggs spoke again. You said you saved the commander's life twice during the war. She looked at him with slight confusion. I didn't say that. He tapped the dismissal paper still sitting on the table. That's what the report said. Her brow furrowed slightly. What report? Briggs leaned forward. The after-action report from the ambush. Tessa had never read it. She rarely read reports about herself. They always felt strange. Detached. Like someone else's story. You saved Garrison, Briggs said. You saved me. He paused. And according to Kowalski, you also spotted the second sniper position before anyone else. Tessa shrugged lightly. Observation. Briggs shook his head slowly. No, he said. That's experience. He pushed the dismissal paper across the table. Which is exactly why this order is officially canceled. Tessa looked down at the paper. Then back at him. I never expected it to stay, she said. Briggs blinked. You did. No. Why? Her answer came without hesitation. Because good leaders correct mistakes. The words landed softly. but they carried more weight than any accusation could have. Briggs almost smiled. For the first time since the ambush, the tension between them eased. But outside the clinic window, the valley stretched toward distant mountains. And those mountains still held unfinished battles. Intel reports were already warning of increased insurgent movement near the northern passes. Soon another mission would come. Another patrol. Another test. And the quiet medic with the hidden past would once again walk into danger. Not to prove herself. Not for recognition. But because saving even one life made the ghosts a little quieter. And sometimes that was enough to keep moving forward, even when the past never truly let go. Why did the quiet medic feel a strange sense of dread when the next mission briefing appeared on the board? 3 days after the clinic conversation, the base returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning drills, vehicle maintenance, radio chatter floating through the dry valley air. But something had shifted. People looked at Tessa Harlow differently now. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially after a mission like the compound ambush. Soldiers who had barely noticed her before now nodded respectfully when she passed. Some even called her by name. It was new and slightly uncomfortable. Tessa had never cared about recognition. In fact, she preferred the opposite: quiet work, quiet results. But the battlefield had a way of revealing things people tried to hide. Commander Briggs noticed the change too. As he limped into the operations tent on his crutches, the large tactical map was already covered in fresh markings. Red circles, movement routes, observation points. Something new was developing in the northern mountains. Kowalski stood near the table, studying the map with a frown. "You're early," Briggs said. Kowalski shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." Briggs followed his gaze. "What's bothering you?" Kowalski tapped a ridge line on the map. "Recon drone spotted movement here last night." "Supply route." "Maybe." Briggs looked closer. "No villages nearby." "Exactly." That meant one thing. Staging area. Insurgent teams often gathered in hidden valleys before launching coordinated attacks. And this location sat dangerously close to the main civilian road. Briggs rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "We send a patrol." "Already approved," Kowalski replied. Then he glanced toward the tent entrance. Tessa had just walked in carrying her medical pack. The conversation paused for a moment. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Kowalski still hadn't completely processed the truth about her past. The quiet medic who predicted ambushes and once operated with recon teams. Briggs motioned toward the map. "We're heading north again." Tessa stepped beside the table. Her eyes scanned the terrain. Rock formations, narrow canyon routes, elevated ridges perfect for overwatch. It took her only a few seconds. Then something inside her expression changed. Barely noticeable. But Briggs caught it. "You've seen terrain like this before," he said. Tessa nodded slowly. "Mountain choke points." "Meaning?" "Perfect place for layered ambushes." Kowalski exhaled. "Fantastic." Briggs studied her again. "What's your concern?" Tessa pointed to the narrow pass leading into the valley. "If I were planning this," she said calmly, "I wouldn't attack from inside the valley." Kowalski frowned. "Why not?" "Too predictable." Her finger moved slightly higher along the map. "I'd place shooters here and here. 2 ridge lines. Both overlooking the pass. Both impossible to approach without being seen." Briggs leaned closer. "You're describing a kill funnel." "Yes." Silence settled around the table. Because if she was right, The patrol wasn't walking into a simple recon mission. They were walking toward a trap. But there was still uncertainty. Drone images didn't show confirmed fighters yet. Just movement. And in war, hesitation sometimes cost more lives than action. Briggs made the decision. We move carefully. Kowalski nodded. Same team. Briggs glanced at Tessa. Yes. She didn't react. Didn't hesitate. Just adjusted the strap on her medical pack. For her, missions were simple. People would get hurt. Her job was to make sure they survived. But as the briefing ended and soldiers began preparing vehicles outside, an old feeling stirred quietly inside her chest. The same feeling she had experienced years ago in the mountains during that recon mission. The subtle warning that something wasn't right. Not fear. Instinct. And instinct had saved lives before. Still, instinct couldn't always change orders. Sometimes all it could do was prepare you for what was coming. Why do some soldiers grow quieter the closer they get to danger? The convoy rolled out just after sunrise. 2 armored vehicles pushed slowly along the winding dirt road, leading toward the northern mountains. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds. Inside the lead vehicle, Kowalski drove while Briggs studied the surrounding ridges through binoculars. Tessa sat in the back beside the radio operator. Her medical bag rested between her boots. No one spoke much. Missions like this created a certain silence. Not uncomfortable, just focused. After 40 minutes, the road narrowed into the mountain pass. Exactly where Tessa had pointed earlier. Tall cliffs rose on both sides. Natural choke point. Perfect for controlling movement. Kowalski muttered under his breath. I hate this road. Briggs continued scanning the ridges. Nothing moved. No flashes. No shadows. Just rock and wind. Still, the quiet felt heavy. Tessa watched the terrain carefully through the rear window. Then something caught her attention. A small pile of disturbed rocks halfway up the slope. Out of place. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Stop the vehicle. Kowalski hit the brakes instantly. What is it? Tessa leaned forward. That rock formation, she said. Briggs followed her gaze. Looks normal. It wasn't there before. Kowalski raised an eyebrow. You memorized the rocks. No, she replied calmly. I memorized the shadow line. Briggs looked again. Now he saw it. The rocks sat slightly outside the natural shadow pattern of the cliff, which meant they had been moved recently. Possible sensor, he asked. Or a marker, she said. For what? Tessa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the radio. Her voice remained steady. Second vehicle maintained distance. Static crackled back. Copy. Then the world exploded. The blast erupted 30 meters ahead of them. A massive plume of dirt and rock shot into the air as the buried explosive detonated. The shockwave slammed into the vehicle like a hammer. Kowalski swore loudly. IED. Before the dust even settled, gunfire erupted from the ridges above. Exactly where Tessa predicted. Rounds snapped against the armored doors. The convoy had driven straight into the kill funnel. But because she had spotted the warning sign, they had stopped just outside the blast radius. 30 meters closer, and the entire lead vehicle would have been destroyed. Briggs grabbed the radio. Contact, ridge positions left and right. The valley erupted into chaos. Soldiers jumped from the vehicles and returned fire toward the cliffs. Enemy fighters moved between rocks high above. They had the advantage. Elevation. Cover. and the element of surprise. Except one thing had gone wrong in their plan. The convoy hadn't reached the explosive, because someone noticed a shadow that didn't belong. Tessa pulled a wounded soldier behind the vehicle as bullets snapped overhead. A grazing wound across the man's forearm. Minor, but bleeding heavily. She wrapped the bandage quickly, then glanced toward the ridgeline. Her eyes tracked movement instinctively. Calculating, watching, listening. Kowalski ducked beside her. "How many?" "6," she replied. "Maybe 8. You counting?" "Yes." "How?" "Reload patterns." Another burst of gunfire echoed across the canyon. Briggs fired several rounds toward the ridge. But the enemy fighters were well hidden. This was exactly the type of ambush Tessa feared. Layered, disciplined, patient. And it was about to get worse. Because suddenly, the radio operator shouted something that froze everyone. "Sir, movement behind us." Briggs turned instantly. Through the dust cloud at the back of the pass, figures were appearing. More fighters, blocking the road. The convoy wasn't just ambushed. They were surrounded. The valley had become a trap. And escape would require something more than firepower. It would require strategy, experience, and the quiet medic who had already predicted half the battle. Because sometimes survival didn't depend on the strongest soldier. It depended on the one who could see the battlefield clearly, even when chaos tried to blind everyone else. Tessa looked toward the narrow ridge path, climbing along the right side of the canyon. A dangerous route. Steep, exposed, but possible. She turned to Briggs. "There's one way out." Briggs followed her gaze, then slowly nodded, because he understood immediately what she was suggesting. And it was risky, very risky. But staying in the valley was worse. For the second time in this war, the plan for survival was coming from the medic everyone once thought had no combat value. And once again, lives were about to depend on whether they trusted her instincts. Not as a medic, but as something far more dangerous. A soldier who understood war. How do you escape a trap when the enemy controls every direction except the one that might kill you? The canyon had become a cage. Gunfire cracked from both ridges while dust and shattered rock rained into the narrow road below. The convoy's armored vehicles were pinned in the pass, their angles too limited to return effective fire. Briggs crouched behind the front tire, breathing hard as rounds chipped stone from the cliff wall above him. Behind them, more insurgents were closing the road. A perfect ambush. Exactly the kind designed to trap a unit until ammunition ran out. Kowalski slid beside him. "We're boxed in." Briggs already knew. His eyes shifted toward Tessa. She was kneeling beside the wounded radio operator, tightening a bandage across the man's shoulder. Her movements were fast, controlled, and strangely calm despite the chaos ripping through the canyon. But her attention wasn't only on the injured soldier. Her eyes kept drifting to the narrow ridge path, climbing along the right side of the canyon wall. The path most people would never notice. Too steep, too exposed, too dangerous, but not impossible. Briggs crawled closer. "You really think that ridge is our exit?" he asked. Tessa finished securing the bandage before answering. "It's their blind side." Kowalski shook his head. "Blind side, they're shooting from both ridges." "Not that ridge," she said. Briggs looked again. The enemy fighters had concentrated on the two dominant cliffs overlooking the pass. Their fire angles controlled the vehicles and the road. But the smaller ridge path on the right side, was partially hidden by jagged rock formations. Climbing it would be brutal, but if someone reached the top, they could flank the ambushers. Kowalski followed the idea slowly. "You're saying we go up there, get above them?" "Yes." Briggs exhaled. "That climb is exposed." Tessa met his eyes. "Staying here is worse." A bullet ricocheted off the armored door inches above them. The decision made itself. Briggs grabbed the radio. "All units prepare to move. Kowalski, take 2 men up the ridge path. Establish fire position above the shooters." Kowalski blinked. "Me? You climb faster than I do on crutches." "Fair point." Tessa stood and adjusted the strap of her medical pack. "I'm coming too." Both men looked at her. "You're the medic," Kowalski said. "Exactly." Briggs hesitated. The ridge climb would draw enemy attention immediately. But if someone got hit up there, they would need her. "Fine," he said, "but you stay behind the shooters." Tessa didn't argue. 3 soldiers sprinted toward the base of the ridge. Loose gravel slid beneath their boots as they began the climb. The canyon erupted with new gunfire as insurgents noticed the movement. Rounds snapped against the rock face. "Move," Kowalski shouted. They climbed fast, hands grabbing rough stone, boots searching for footholds. The path narrowed quickly, forcing them to move single file. Tessa climbed last, not because she was slow, because medics stayed where they could reach everyone. Halfway up the ridge, a shot cracked from the opposite cliff. The soldier in front of her cried out and collapsed. A round had punched through his upper arm. He nearly slid backward down the slope. Tessa caught him instantly. "Hold still." Blood poured from the wound. Not fatal, but dangerous. And the climb had stopped. Kowalski looked back. "We can't stay here." Tessa worked quickly. "Pressure bandage. Wrap. Secure." 30 seconds. The soldier clenched his jaw. "I'm good," he said. "You're not," she replied calmly. "But you can still climb." The soldier nodded. The group resumed moving. Above them the ridge widened slightly. Just enough space to kneel and fire. Kowalski reached the top first. He peeked over the rocks. 3 insurgents crouched behind a firing position less than 30 meters away, completely focused on the vehicles below. They hadn't expected attackers from above. Kowalski raised his rifle. "Now!" 3 quick shots cracked through the mountain air. The insurgents dropped instantly. Below them, the canyon firefight suddenly shifted. Without those shooters covering the pass, the soldiers near the vehicles pushed forward with renewed fire. Briggs heard the difference immediately. He grabbed the radio. "Kowalski, we're on the ridge. Status: 3 down." Briggs almost smiled. For the first time since the ambush began, the trap had a crack in it. But the fight wasn't over yet. Movement appeared along the far ridge as more insurgents realized their flank had been exposed. The firefight intensified again. Up on the ridge, Tessa scanned the terrain. Then something caught her eye. Farther down the slope, another group of fighters was climbing toward their position. 4 of them. "Vast." She spoke quietly. "Kowalski." He followed her gaze. "Great," he muttered. The soldiers raised their rifles. The enemy fighters were close now. 20 meters. 15. Shots exploded between the rocks as both sides opened fire. 1 insurgent dropped instantly. Another dove behind cover. But the remaining 2 kept pushing upward. Desperate. Aggressive. One of them fired wildly toward the ridge top. The bullet struck the soldier Tessa had bandaged earlier. This time the impact threw him sideways. He collapsed against the rocks. Blood spread across his vest. Chest wound. Bad. Very bad. Kowalski cursed. Tessa. She was already moving. Bullets snapped against the stone as she crawled toward the injured man. Her hands pressed hard against the wound. Blood pumped between her fingers. The soldier's breathing turned ragged. Tessa, he gasped. You're okay, she said softly. She reached for the chest seal in her kit. Her movements slowed deliberately. Carefully, even while gunfire exploded around them. Because rushing meant mistakes. And mistakes killed people. Kowalski fired another burst toward the approaching fighters. One dropped. The last one disappeared behind a boulder, just 10 meters below the ridge. Too close. Dangerously close. Kowalski shouted to Briggs over the radio. We're taking pressure up here. Below in the canyon, Briggs heard the urgency. He looked toward the ridge where Tessa had climbed. And for a brief moment, a heavy realization settled over him. If that ridge team collapsed, the entire convoy would be trapped again. Everything now depended on those 4 soldiers above the canyon. And one of them was the medic who once stood silently in his office holding a dismissal paper. The same medic who had now saved his life twice. Briggs tightened his grip on the rifle. Hold that ridge, he said into the radio. Above him, Tessa finished sealing the wounded soldier's chest wound. His breathing stabilized slightly. Still fragile, but alive. She looked toward the boulder where the last insurgent hid. Kowalski whispered, He's waiting for us to move. Tessa studied the rock, then quietly said something unexpected. No, he's waiting for me. Kowalski blinked. What? But before he could stop her, Tessa picked up a rifle lying beside the wounded soldier. The quiet medic who had spent months pretending to be nothing more than a support role slowly rose from behind the ridge. Her eyes steady, her posture controlled, because some skills never disappear. They just stay hidden until the moment they're needed. And the insurgent behind the boulder had just made a mistake. He assumed the medic wouldn't fight back. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. And for the 3rd time in this war, someone's life was about to be saved by the soldier everyone once underestimated. Why would a medic pick up a rifle when her entire purpose was to save lives? The wind along the ridge carried the smell of dust and gunpowder. Below them, the canyon still echoed with scattered bursts of gunfire as Briggs and the convoy pushed back against the ambush. But up on the ridge, everything had gone strangely quiet. Too quiet. The last insurgent crouched behind the boulder 10 meters below them. Waiting. Listening. Kowalski stayed low behind the rock ledge, rifle aimed at the boulder's edge. He's pinned, he whispered. Tessa shook her head slightly. No. Kowalski frowned. He's not pinned. He's patient. The difference mattered. A pinned fighter panicked. A patient fighter waited for mistakes. And the moment someone stood up, someone died. Tessa looked down at the wounded soldier beside her. His breathing was steadier now, the chest seal holding pressure across the wound. But he couldn't move. Not yet. And if the insurgent made it over that ridge, the soldier would never make it off the mountain. Kowalski leaned closer. We can wait him out. Tessa studied the slope carefully. Loose gravel. Shallow rock cover. Angles. Distances. Then she said something quiet but certain. He's not alone. Kowalski blinked. What? Listen. At first he heard nothing. Just wind. Then faint movement. Boots scraping stone farther down the slope. More fighters climbing. Reinforcements. Kowalski cursed under his breath. How many? Tessa tilted her head slightly. 2, maybe 3. If they reached the ridge, the advantage would disappear instantly, and the wounded soldier wouldn't survive the retreat. Kowalski exhaled slowly. So what's the play, medic? Tessa didn't answer right away. She simply reached for the rifle beside her. The weapon felt familiar in her hands. Heavier than a medical kit. But not unfamiliar. Because long before she became the quiet medic everyone underestimated, she had carried rifles like this across mountains and deserts. Watching. Waiting. Protecting the team. Kowalski watched her check the weapon calmly. You said you were recon medical. I was. That doesn't explain the way you're holding that rifle. She glanced at him briefly. I practiced. The answer was simple, but the truth behind it ran deeper. Because sometimes medics in recon teams weren't just medics. Sometimes they were the last line between survival and disaster. Tessa moved carefully along the ridge until she reached a slightly higher rock. Kowalski followed. You're not seriously going to. Cover the left side, she said quietly. He hesitated. You sure about this? She met his eyes. Those reinforcements reach the ridge, we lose the position. That was all the explanation he needed. Kowalski shifted his rifle. All right. Tessa took one slow breath, then stepped out from behind the rock. The insurgent behind the boulder reacted instantly. His rifle swung upward, but Tessa had already seen the movement. One controlled shot cracked through the canyon. The insurgent collapsed beside the boulder. Silence returned for half a heartbeat. Then the two fighters climbing the slope opened fire. Bullets slammed into the ridge rocks as they rushed upward. Kowalski returned fire immediately. One insurgent stumbled but kept moving. They were desperate now. If they took the ridge, the ambush could still succeed. Tessa dropped back beside the wounded soldier and checked his breathing again. Still stable. But time was running thin. Kowalski fired again. The second insurgent fell just meters from the ridge. The last one froze behind a rock halfway up the slope. Neither side moved. Both waiting. Then the radio crackled beside them. Briggs' voice. Kowalski, report. Kowalski grabbed it. Ridge secure, reinforcements neutralized. Static crackled. Then Briggs replied. Good, enemy breaking contact in the canyon. Below them, the sound of gunfire had already started fading. The ambush was collapsing. Without control of the ridge, the insurgents had lost their advantage. The trap had failed. Kowalski lowered his rifle slowly. For the first time since the explosion in the pass, the canyon felt calm again. He looked at Tessa. You realize something. She was already repacking her medical kit. What? If we hadn't stopped the vehicle earlier. She nodded. The IED would have destroyed it. And if we hadn't taken this ridge, the convoy would have been surrounded. Kowalski exhaled slowly. You just saved all of us. Tessa shook her head slightly. No. He frowned. What do you mean, no? She gestured toward the wounded soldier beside them. He's still alive. That's the job. Kowalski studied her quietly. You really believe that? Yes. She paused while tightening the bandage around the soldier's chest. Then she added softly, saving one life is enough reason to fight. The evacuation helicopter arrived 30 minutes later. As the aircraft lifted off from the canyon floor, Briggs sat inside the cabin across from her again. Just like the last mission. Dust swirled beneath the helicopter as the mountains shrank below them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Briggs finally said something he had been thinking since the ridge. "You saved the convoy today." Tessa shook her head again. "We survived together." He held up a small folded paper. The same dismissal order. Except now, the signature line had been crossed out. Briggs tore the paper slowly in half. Then again. Small pieces drifted into the trash container beside the cabin wall. "That was the worst decision I made this year," he said quietly. Tessa looked out the helicopter window. The mountains stretched endlessly beneath them. Silent. Unforgiving. Then she said something simple. "Good leaders learn." Briggs studied her face carefully. "You could have told me about your past." "I could have. Why didn't you?" She thought about that for a moment, then answered honestly. "Because respect earned in silence lasts longer than respect demanded with words." Briggs nodded slowly. That lesson would stay with him long after the war ended. The helicopter continued toward base. Inside the cabin, the wounded soldier slept peacefully. Alive. Another life carried safely out of the mountains. Tessa finally relaxed back into her seat. The past still followed her. The recon mission. The commander she couldn't save. Those memories would always exist. But today had added something new. Proof that even after loss, you could still protect others. You could still stand between danger and the people beside you. And sometimes the strongest soldiers weren't the loudest. They were the ones who worked quietly. The ones who never asked for recognition. The ones who simply acted when it mattered most. Because dignity rarely announces itself. It moves silently through chaos. It saves lives without demanding applause. And in the end, the soldiers who change the battlefield the most are often the ones everyone once believed had no skills at all.